There is something strange about the hardest tests in life. They rarely announce themselves. Nobody walks into your room one morning and tells you, "Today is the day you will be tested. Pay attention. Every decision you make today will matter." No, the most important tests usually look like ordinary days. A message that never comes, a door that closes, a person who suddenly changes, a plan that falls apart after you spent months believing it would work, a season where you keep asking God for an answer, and all you seem to receive is silence. And that is why I want you to listen carefully to this message. Because what if the season you thought was proof that you were losing was actually the season that revealed you had already won? What if the moment you thought heaven had forgotten, you was the very moment your character was being revealed? And what if the test was never about whether you could get what you wanted? What if the test was about what you would become when you couldn't? Stay with that thought. Because there is a reason this title says the test is over. Not because every problem in your life has magically disappeared. Not because everything you have been waiting for has suddenly arrived. And not because you have reached some perfect place where nothing can hurt you anymore. The test is over because something inside you changed, and you may not have noticed it. That is the part most people miss. They expect the end of a test to feel like fireworks. They imagine a dramatic moment, a miracle, a sudden door opening, a message arriving at exactly the right time. But sometimes the end of a test is much quieter. Sometimes it sounds like this: "I don't need to chase that anymore." Sometimes it looks like walking away from something you once begged to keep. Sometimes it is the first night you sleep peacefully without knowing what tomorrow will bring. Sometimes it is realizing that you can lose something you desperately wanted without losing yourself. And maybe that is what happened to you. Maybe there was a version of you who needed every door to open, every person to stay, every plan to succeed, every prayer to receive an immediate answer. But somewhere along the way, that version of you began to disappear. Not because you became cold, because you became steady. You learned how to stand without applause. You learned how to continue without confirmation. You learned how to pray without demanding a timetable. And that matters, because anyone can remain faithful when everything is going their way. The deeper question is what happens when nothing is. Think about the moments nobody saw, the night you almost gave up, the conversation you wanted to have but never did, the opportunity you could have taken out of desperation, but something inside you told you to wait, the person who hurt you, and the revenge you imagined but never carried out, the season when you could have become bitter, but somehow you kept your heart from becoming exactly like the people who wounded it. Those moments may have looked insignificant. They weren't. There are decisions you made in private that changed the direction of your life more than any public achievement ever could. And perhaps the greatest one was this: you kept going without knowing how the story would end. That is not a small thing. That is faith. Not the kind of faith that speaks loudly when everything is comfortable. The quieter kind. The kind that sits alone at midnight and says, "I don't understand this, but I refuse to believe that my life has no meaning." Maybe you've had a season like that. If you have, don't rush past it, because I want you to remember something. You were not necessarily being punished because the road was difficult. Difficulty does not automatically mean abandonment. A closed door does not automatically mean rejection. A delay does not automatically mean denial. Sometimes the delay reveals what the destination could never reveal. It shows you who you are when nobody is giving you what you want. And that brings us to the question hiding underneath this entire message. What exactly were you being tested on? It probably wasn't your ability to suffer. God does not need to prove how much pain you can tolerate. The deeper test was likely about your response. Could you keep your integrity when compromise looked easier? Could you remain patient when impatience seemed justified? Could you walk away when your emotions wanted you to stay? Could you forgive without pretending the wound never happened? Could you continue believing in a future you could not yet see? And perhaps most importantly, could you become someone who no longer needed the old life to validate the new person you were becoming? That is where the story begins. Because the test wasn't one moment. It was hidden inside hundreds of ordinary moments. And if you look back carefully, you may realize something that changes the way you remember your entire past. You were being watched by the only audience that mattered. Not by people, not by social media, not by the people who doubted you, not by the ones who underestimated you, but by God. And the most powerful part is this. You may have thought you were simply surviving, but you were learning. You may have thought you were being delayed, but you were developing. You may have thought you were losing people, but you were discovering what you could no longer carry into the next chapter. So if you've ever wondered why certain things had to happen the way they did, stay with me. Because the answer becomes much clearer when we look at what happened after the doors started closing. And that is where your real test began. There is a reason people often misunderstand their hardest seasons. When something hurts for a long time, we naturally assume something must be wrong. If the relationship ends, we call it failure. If the opportunity disappears, we call it loss. If the plan takes longer than expected, we call it delay. If someone walks away, we ask what we did wrong. But sometimes the question is not, why did this happen to me? Sometimes the better question is, who was I becoming while this was happening? That question changes everything. Because your life may contain moments that looked completely meaningless at the time. A rejection that embarrassed you. A friendship that slowly became distant. A job or opportunity you thought was perfect. A prayer you repeated so many times that eventually you stopped asking. A dream you carried for years that suddenly became impossible. And perhaps the strangest part was that nobody around you understood why those things affected you so deeply. They saw the outside. They didn't see the internal battle. They didn't know how many times you had to talk yourself out of giving up. They didn't know how often you smiled during the day and then questioned everything at night. They didn't know that sometimes your biggest victory was simply refusing to make a permanent decision during a temporary emotional storm. That matters, because the test was not designed to make you look strong. It was revealing whether you could become strong without needing to look strong. There is a difference. Anyone can pretend. But pressure reveals, waiting reveals, disappointment reveals, power reveals, and silence reveals. When you have nothing left to impress anyone with, what remains? That is the person the test exposes. Maybe this is why some of your hardest seasons felt strangely private. There was no audience, no applause, no dramatic sign telling you that you were doing the right thing. You simply had to choose, again and again and again. That is what makes these seasons exhausting. Not always the difficulty itself, the uncertainty. You can survive a hard day when you know tomorrow will be better. But what happens when you don't know? What happens when you pray and still have to wait? What happens when you do everything you know to do and the answer still doesn't come? That is where many people abandon themselves. They become someone they never wanted to be. They become angry. They become cynical. They stop trusting anyone. They start believing that kindness is weakness. They decide that the only way to survive is to become harder. Maybe you were tempted by that too. Maybe there was a moment when you thought, if nobody cares, why should I? If nobody is loyal, why should I be? If people keep hurting me, why shouldn't I hurt them first? And yet, something stopped you. Maybe it wasn't dramatic. Maybe it was simply the last piece of your conscience refusing to disappear. You still chose not to become cruel. You still chose to move forward. You still chose to protect your peace. You still chose to leave certain things alone. That was part of the test. Not perfection, direction. You didn't have to respond perfectly every time. You had to keep returning to the person you were becoming. That distinction is important, because sometimes people think being chosen means never struggling. But real growth doesn't look like that. You can be confused and still be growing. You can cry and still be strong. You can feel afraid and still move forward. You can have questions and still have faith. You can be tired and still refuse to quit. Perhaps that is why this season lasted longer than you expected. It wasn't simply waiting for an external event. It was developing an internal capacity. Because imagine receiving the thing you prayed for while still carrying the mindset that made your old life painful. Would it really feel like a blessing? Sometimes what needs to change first is not the environment. It is your relationship with the environment. You stop needing everyone to understand you. You stop explaining every decision. You stop chasing people who have already chosen distance. You stop forcing doors. You stop confusing anxiety with intuition. You stop believing that every opportunity is your opportunity. And slowly, you become quieter. Not weaker, quieter. You don't react to everything. You don't answer every accusation. You don't chase every invitation. You start asking a different question. Does this belong in the person I am becoming? That. There is usually a moment after a long season when something feels unfamiliar. Nothing dramatic happens. You wake up, you go through your day, you answer messages, you do your work, you eat, you sleep. Everything looks normal, but internally, something is missing. And at first, you might think something is wrong. You might wonder why you're no longer desperate for the things you used to desperately want. Why doesn't that person's silence hurt the same way? Why don't you feel the need to prove yourself? Why? Are you suddenly comfortable not knowing? Why can you sit in uncertainty without immediately trying to control it? That is when you begin to understand. The test wasn't only changing your circumstances. It was changing your relationship with uncertainty. And that is a profound kind of growth. Because there is a version of peace that only appears after you realize you cannot control everything. You can control your choices, your boundaries, your effort, your honesty, your response. But you cannot control who stays. You cannot control who misunderstands you. You cannot control when another person changes. You cannot control how quickly an opportunity arrives. And once you stop trying to control what was never yours to control, you become free. Maybe that's why the ending of this season doesn't look the way you imagined. You thought passing the test would mean getting the prize. But perhaps the first reward was becoming impossible to manipulate with the same things that once controlled you. Think about that. What used to make you panic? Rejection, silence, being misunderstood, being alone, losing someone's approval. Now imagine those things happening, and you still remain yourself. That's strength. Not because you don't feel anything, because you feel it without allowing it to own you. And perhaps this is why certain people suddenly stopped recognizing you. Not because you became arrogant, because you became less available for chaos. You stopped participating in conversations that existed only to create conflict. You stopped explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. You stopped begging for clarity from people who benefited from keeping you confused. You stopped returning to places that required you to abandon your peace just to belong. And maybe there was a painful realization attached to that. Some people were not meant to walk into your next chapter, not because they were necessarily evil, not because you have to hate them, but because some relationships belong to one season. That doesn't make the memories fake. It means the chapter ended. And this is where many people make a mistake. They keep trying to reopen a chapter simply because they are afraid of what the blank page might contain. But you cannot write a new story while constantly rereading the previous one. Perhaps that's what the test was preparing you for, not merely to survive loss, to stop treating loss as proof that you are losing. There is a difference. Sometimes losing something is how you discover what you never should have built your identity around. And then something even more surprising happens. Your standards change. Your prayers change. Your definition of success changes. You stop asking only, God, give me what I want. And you begin asking, God, give me what is right for me, even if I don't recognize it yet. That's a completely different prayer, because now you are no longer trying to control the outcome. You are asking for alignment, and maybe that is why the next chapter cannot look exactly like the old one. The old you wanted certainty. The new you wants peace. The old you wanted applause. The new you wants purpose. The old you wanted everyone to understand. The new you knows that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of becoming honest with yourself. The old you wanted immediate answers. The new you can survive the question. That last one matters more than you realize, Because there are seasons when the answer is not given immediately. Not because you are forgotten, but because learning how to live without the answer may be part of the preparation. Think about the strongest people you know. Their strength often wasn't built during their easiest years. It was built when they had to make decisions without guarantees, when they had to keep going without applause, when they had to choose integrity without knowing whether anyone would reward them. And perhaps you have been doing the same thing quietly for longer than you realize. That's why the title doesn't say, "You are about to take the test." It says, "The test is over." Because the evidence is not necessarily that everything around you has changed. The evidence may be that you have. You no longer need the old answer. You no longer need the old person. You no longer need the old validation. You no longer need to force the old door open. And that is when something becomes possible. You can finally recognize the right door when it appears. Because imagine if the door opened a year ago. Would you have walked through it as the person you are today? Maybe. Maybe not. Only God knows. But what you can know is this. The waiting did something. The silence did something. The disappointment did something. The ending did something. And if you let those experiences make you wiser instead of bitter, then they did not get the final word. You did. If this part of the message describes a change you have quietly noticed in yourself, you can leave one sentence in the comments. I am not who I was. Not as a performance, just as a reminder. Because sometimes you need to see your own words written down before you realize how far you've come. And now we reach the deepest part, because passing the test is not the end of the story. The real question, what were you being prepared to recognize after you passed it? And the answer may be very different from what you expected. Part 4. The test was never about what you could get. Maybe you thought this message would end by telling you that something wonderful is about to happen. Maybe you expected a promise that a blessing is coming, a door is opening, a miracle is near. And perhaps something good will happen. I hope it does. But I don't want to give you a shallow ending, because if we have followed this story honestly, then the deeper revelation is much more meaningful. The greatest evidence that you passed the test is not that you finally got what you wanted. It is that what you wanted no longer has the power to determine your worth. Read that again in your mind, because that changes everything. You can still desire something. You can still pray for it. You can still hope for it. But you no longer have to become desperate for it. You can want the relationship without begging the wrong person to love you. You can want success without allowing failure to define you. You can want recognition without needing strangers to validate your existence. You can want a new chapter without hating the chapter that brought you here. That is maturity. That is freedom. And perhaps that is what heaven was watching. Not whether you could endure pain forever, but whether pain would be allowed to decide who you became. There were moments when you could have become cruel. You didn't. There were moments when you could have abandoned your values. You hesitated. There were moments when you could have allowed disappointment to turn into hatred. You fought against it. There were moments when you had no evidence that things would improve. And somehow, you continued. Maybe imperfectly. Maybe with tears. Maybe with questions. Maybe with days when your faith felt stronger than others. But you continued. That matters. Because faith isn't always a feeling. Sometimes faith is simply refusing to close the book while you're still on the page where everything looks hopeless. You don't know what the next page says, but you turn it anyway. And that is where your story stands now. Not at the end, at the threshold. The old chapter taught you what you can survive. The next chapter will ask you what you can build. That is different. Survival taught you endurance. Now you need discernment. Survival taught you how to hold on. Now you need to know when to let go. Survival taught you how to protect yourself. Now you must learn how to trust wisely. Survival taught you how to live with less. Now you must learn how to receive without fear. And that last one can be surprisingly difficult, because when you've spent a long time disappointed, even good things can make you suspicious. When you've spent years waiting, you may struggle to believe something is actually yours. When you've been betrayed, you may question genuine love. When you've been rejected, acceptance can feel uncomfortable. When you've lived through instability, peace can feel strange. So don't be surprised if your next chapter requires a different kind of courage. The courage to receive. The courage to believe that not every door hides disappointment. The courage to stop expecting every good thing to disappear. The courage to let yourself become hopeful again. And perhaps that is the final piece of the test. Can you move forward without dragging the old fear into every new room? Can you enter something beautiful without constantly preparing yourself for it to collapse? Can you allow God to write something new without demanding that it look like the old story? That is where your choice begins. Because the past may explain you, but it does not have to control you. Your scars may tell the truth about what happened, but they do not have to predict what happens next. Your history matters, but it is not your prison. And if you have been waiting for some dramatic confirmation that the difficult season meant something, perhaps the confirmation is already visible. Look at your decisions. Look at what you no longer tolerate. Look at what no longer impresses you. Look at what you now value. Look at the peace you have developed. Look at the things you survived without becoming the person you feared you would become. That is evidence. Maybe the test didn't end with a trumpet. Maybe it ended with a quiet decision. I won't go back.